When Tiberium first arrived on the Earth in 1995, few could have predicted that the alien crystal would become the most valuable and dangerous resource on the planet, spreading rapidly around the world, transforming the Earth's natural environment in order to facilitate its own growth. While scientists devoted a lot of time to studying and understanding the green crystal, it was ultimately the Brotherhood of Nod who pioneered the industrial harvesting and refining of the mineral. This allowed the organization to generate great wealth for itself, and over time, allowed the Brotherhood to control almost half the world's known Tiberium supply. The other half was split between the United Nations-backed Global Defense Initiative and a contingent of various other neutral countries, not aligned with either GDI or the Brotherhood. Both factions had their own ideological views that were diametrically opposed to one another. Whereas the Brotherhood saw Tiberium and its proliferation as humanity's salvation, GDI sought to control and limit the crystal's spread, and prevent it from completely destroying the Earth's natural environment. These differing views, of course, led to violent conflicts between the two factions, the most significant of which were the First, Second, and Third Tiberium Wars. Through this roughly combined 50 to 60 year timeline, the methods of harvesting, processing, and storing of Tiberium would evolve. While the Brotherhood of Nod may have been the first to invent technologies that allowed for the quick harvesting and processing of Tiberium, it didn't take long for GDI to catch up to them. During the First and Second Tiberium Wars, both factions used the exact same types of harvesters, refineries, and silos. I couldn't find any information stating which faction actually invented any specific vehicles or structures. For example, did the Brotherhood invent the harvesters that are most commonly seen in the first two wars? Or did GDI? The same question applies to the refineries and silos. I think there are one of two possibilities that could explain this. The first is that GDI and Nod are constantly engaged in espionage against one another, stealing each other's plans and technologies in an attempt to gain any advantage. So it wouldn't surprise me if, say, GDI stole the technology from Nod before the first war, and then the reverse happened before the start of the second war. The second possibility could be that the blueprints for these vehicles and structures were invented by one or more third-party companies. Companies that may have had ties to both the Brotherhood and GDI, who then sold the designs to both factions in order to profit off the conflict between the two. However, sometime in the early 2000s, GDI signed a 100-year contract with Otani Lincoln Laboratories, which involved the researching and developing of any future combat and support infrastructure for the organization. Personally, I think the first possibility of espionage is the one that most likely happened, since it has the most evidence to support it. A good example being Nod's development of the Redeemer Mechwalker, thanks to stealing blueprints of GDI's Marv. And with GDI's exclusive contract with OLL, the organization wouldn't need to be as reliant on working with multiple third-party companies who could possibly have ties to the Brotherhood. The first and probably most dangerous step in the process of refining Tiberium is the actual extracting of the crystal from the Earth, most commonly known as harvesting, and is primarily done by vehicles called harvesters. The reason vehicles were needed was not only due to greater efficiency in mineral extraction, but also because of the particles and fumes that emanate from the crystals that are completely toxic to humans, with prolonged exposure eventually resulting in death. There is also the constant threat of attacks by hostile forces looking to either steal the harvested Tiberium for themselves, or to hinder another faction's efforts at funding combat operations on the battlefield. Before and during the First Tiberium War, both Nod and GDI primarily made use of what I'll just call the First Generation Harvester, a vehicle which sort of looks like a beetle. This harvester is a four-wheeled, all-terrain vehicle operated by one driver. It has two large claws on the front, which allows it to dig and scoop up Tiberium crystals and the pods that they are attached to into the mouth of the harvester. The crystals then make their way under the main cabin of the vehicle and into the back of the cylindrical-shaped container pod. Once the harvester has collected all the Tiberium it can carry, it immediately heads back to a nearby refinery to offload it for processing. Though the vehicle can function adequately in almost any environment, it does have a slow travel speed, making it vulnerable to attacks from hostiles, but it was built with durability in mind, and cannot be destroyed so easily. The harvester has no weapons on it with which to defend itself, but if enemy infantry get too close, it can certainly run them over. As the First Tiberium War waged on, both sides fielded a new version of the Harvester, though this Harvester did not completely replace the first generation one. I'll just refer to this one as the Renegade Harvester, since it was seen in combat operations that took place during the events of Command & Conquer Renegade. The Renegade Harvester was basically an improved version of the first generation one, being all-terrain, but with 10 wheels, 8 at the rear, and 2 at the front, and also having an operational crew of 1. It still had 2 claws on the front to help scoop Tiberium crystals into its mouth, but it also had 2 rolling crushers at the entrance of the mouth that helped to further break down the crystals into smaller pieces. The pieces are then stored in the container on the back of the vehicle, this container being more of a rectangle shape rather than cylindrical. These 2 types of harvesters stayed in use until around the time of the Second Tiberium War, when they were both replaced by the larger and sturdier second generation harvester. This harvester was a 10-wheeled all-terrain vehicle that resembled a large semi-truck, with 1 or maybe even 2 crewmen to operate it. Instead of using large claws to pick up and scoop Tiberium into the vehicle, this harvester used razor blades in order to better break down the Tiberium pods and crystals before entering the vehicle itself. The harvester also seems to have a small vacuum system built into it in order to allow it to suck up the broken crystal shards up into the vehicle, passing through the cabin below, where presumably the driver sits, and into the container mounted on the back of the vehicle. The vehicles had to be extra careful transporting Tiberium vinifera, or blue Tiberium as it was more commonly known, since it is more volatile compared to the green Tiberium. If the harvester is attacked while carrying blue Tiberium, the resulting explosion would be large enough to damage or destroy infantry, vehicles, and even structures around it. Some commanders could utilize this to their advantage by using a harvester filled with blue Tiberium as a bomb truck, in order to wreak havoc on an enemy base. Once it has finished collecting Tiberium, the vehicle returns to the refinery where the crate on the back of it is picked up by a crane. The crane uses claws to lift up the Tiberium-filled crate and carries it into the interior of the refinery for unloading and processing. Once the crate is empty, it is placed back onto the harvester, which is now ready to go out and collect more Tiberium. Around the time of the Third Tiberium War, the designs of both Nod and GDI's harvesters split into separate directions, these designs being based off each organization's combat doctrine. For the Brotherhood of Nod, the design of their third-generation harvesters was a significant departure from their predecessors. The wheels were replaced with tank treads, and the vehicle was designed to have a sleek body which would allow it to maintain a lower profile. It had 1 driver and was equipped with 2 large claws placed on the back of the vehicle, allowing it to dig deep into the earth in order to uproot Tiberium crystals. The crystals would then be stored in 2 large compartments located on each side of the vehicle itself. The vehicle could move quickly compared to previous generation harvesters, and most importantly, it came equipped with its very own stealth generator. This allowed the vehicles to continue harvesting operations without needing to worry about being constantly harassed by GDI patrols. Though they still needed to be careful of certain GDI vehicles, such as pit bulls or Orca aircraft, equipped with scanners to detect stealthed units. Also important to mention is that harvesters in the Black Hand's arsenal were not equipped with stealth generators. Once the Tiberium is collected, the harvester quickly returns to the refinery to unload, which requires the vehicle to temporarily turn off its stealth generator. During the interim years between the Second and Third Tiberium War, GDI came up with a couple of new designs for their third-generation harvesters. One of them was called the GDI Tiberium HRV Harvester, or Harvey for short. This design seemed to be an upgrade of the vehicle used during the time of Tib War II, since it made use of a vacuum system to suck up and break down Tiberium crystals. It even seems that prototypes of this vehicle were built and tested, but ultimately not adopted for wider use by GDI. Instead, the organization would go on to adopt a different variant for wider use. Similar to Nod's third-generation harvester, this vehicle also used tank treads in place of wheels, and was operated by 1 driver. Instead of having a sleek design like the Nod harvester, GDI went with a large and more bulky design, as they weren't concerned with making sure their harvesters were stealthy, instead giving them the ability to defend themselves via an automated machine gun turret mounted on top of the vehicle behind the driver cabin. While the machine gun is the standard armament for most harvesters in GDI's arsenal, those that are in use by the Steel Talons and Zocom divisions have their own unique mounted armaments. For Zocom, the machine gun is replaced with a rocket launcher, and for the Steel Talons, a small bunker is placed on top for infantry of any specialization to garrison. As for how the harvester actually extracts the Tiberium from the earth, it uses a similar mechanism to that of the first generation harvesters, in the form of 2 large claws. The cabin of the harvester leans forward and lowers a ramp with a conveyor belt system on it to ground level. The vehicle then uses its claws to scoop Tiberium crystals onto the ramp, which then carries the crystals up under the cabin and down into the main body of the vehicle, where the crystals are further broken up into smaller pieces, which are compressed and fill 4 thin containers on the back of the vehicle, creating what I'll just call Tiberium rods. Once full, the harvester returns to the refinery to unload these rods for processing. Finally, there was a new harvesting method that was developed some time after the Second War, this being tall towers called Tiberium spikes. Whether these towers were developed due to the evolution of Tiberium from an organic-based mineral to a self-replicating proton lattice is unknown. Either way, these spikes have become a common sight throughout much of the world's blue and yellow zones. The Tiberium spike's purpose is basically the same as that of an oil derrick, only instead of drilling for oil, the spike is drilling deep underground to access subterranean Tiberium deposits. It can even process the extracted Tiberium on site. In terms of its power needs, the Tiberium spike is self-sufficient thanks to the vertical rows of rotating solar panels attached to the tower itself. Tiberium spikes are typically owned by neutral factions, whether those being private companies or governments not associated with either GDI or Nod. However, both sides won't hesitate to requisition these towers in order to reroute their funds to use in order to sustain their own combat operations in the region. In GDI's case, their commanders are, quote, encouraged to provide compensation to the legitimate owners of the commandeered Tiberium spikes, in the form of GDI vouchers that could be redeemed at Reykjavik for credits. As for the Brotherhood, well, for them, to the victor go the spoils.
Building captured.
I'll also briefly mention the Mammoth Armored Reclamation Vehicle, or MARV, that was part of GDI's arsenal during the Third War. A mobile refinery in itself, able to harvest and process any Tiberium that it collects passing through a field. Once Tiberium has been successfully harvested from the Earth, it then must be taken to a nearby refinery for processing. The methods of transferring and processing Tiberium remained mostly the same from the start of the First War to the end of the Second War and the resulting Firestorm crisis. In terms of transferring collected Tiberium to the refinery itself, this method changed over the years. During the First Tiberium War, this transference depended on the type of harvester that was used to extract the mineral. I'll start with the first generation harvester that we see during the events of Tiberian Dawn. It's difficult to tell just based off the in-game animation exactly how the Tiberium is unloaded from the harvester's cylinder. The cylinder is first slid off the harvester into a sort of transfer mechanism which grabs it and orients the cylinder vertical to the roof of the refinery. My first interpretation of this was that the Tiberium is unloaded upward from the ceiling, but I actually think it is unloaded from the hole in the top of the cylinder. Especially when looking at older but more detailed rendered images of the factory in 3D, it does actually have a porthole on the front of the wall of the refinery that could line up with the hole on top of the cylinder when oriented vertically, which would allow for the proper unloading of Tiberium into the refinery. For some reason, the hole in the wall is just not seen on the in-game version. Once the cylinder is empty, it is then oriented horizontally and placed back onto the harvester. Even though the events of Renegade also take place during the First Tiberium War, the transference process was completely different. When the harvester reaches the refinery to unload, 2 large arms extend from the front of the structure and proceed to just absorb the broken down Tiberium shards from the harvester. These shards make their way through the tubes on the arms and into the refinery. These arms are not even connected to the vehicle itself, which really does not make any sense. The only reason I can think of for why they wouldn't be in some way physically connected to it is for gameplay reasons. The AI of the harvester does not seem to be able to consistently line up perfectly with the refinery's transfer mechanism, so I believe that's why Westwood just settled on it looking like it's just absorbing the Tiberium through the vehicle. Though this is just speculation on my part, as I can't think of an in-lore reason for it to be this way. Once the crystals have been transferred to the refinery, the actual processing can begin. It starts by using a machine to further break down the larger chunks of Tiberium. This also helps to separate the crystals from the organic pods that end up being collected with them during harvesting. The machine continues to break the crystals down until they are nothing but small piles of grains. These grain piles are then put on a conveyor belt system, which takes them to a large furnace. This furnace burns all other impurities from the grain, so that all that is left is pure Tiberium. The pure Tiberium is then melted down and molded into small Tiberium bars, or ingots. These ingots are then either sold for credits on the world market, or immediately put to use in the construction and expansion of a base. However, this isn't the end of the process. as all the impurities and byproducts separated from the crystals are then stored in a large tank. This liquid waste is highly toxic to humans, and it stays in the tank where it is further separated and stored into 3 different barrels. As for what is done with these barrels of Tiberium byproduct, I assume some of it could be recycled somehow, or perhaps buried in an underground bunker similar to how nuclear waste is disposed of, though I wouldn't be surprised if a new Tiberium field began to form at said burial site. Of course, for the Brotherhood of Nod, this waste can be weaponized and used on the battlefield in the form of chemical warriors. As mentioned, I believe that this system of Tiberium processing was the one most commonly used during the period encompassing the First Tiberium War to the Second War and Firestorm Crisis, though I imagine that the actual machines used inside the refineries between the 2 wars was different, and obviously the transference system was different, given that the harvesters themselves were completely different vehicles. Same with the exterior structure of the refineries themselves. Not only did the evolution of Tiberium change the way that it interacted with the Earth's natural environment, it also changed the way that it would be processed. Just like with the harvesters, GDI and Nod developed their own different versions of the new refinery structures. However, both shared similarities in that the refinement was done openly, exposed to the outside, rather than in a completely enclosed interior like previous refineries. They also completely skipped the process of further breaking down the crystals into smaller grains. I believe this is due primarily for 2 reasons. The first being that there was no longer any need to worry about organic pods attached to the crystals, thereby not needing to separate all the extra undesirable elements that are contained within those pods from the Tiberium. And the second is that the harvesters themselves could incorporate systems that could now internally further break down the crystals into even smaller shards. Once the harvesters reach the refinery, the transference mechanisms differ between each faction's refineries. For GDI, the Tiberium rods on the back of the harvester are picked up by a robotic arm, and each rod is dropped into 4 separate tubes along the rim of the circular vat. For the Brotherhood, the Tiberium looks to be sucked out of the containers on the sides of the harvester through tubes, which lead to the main vat in the middle. Both refineries take the raw Tiberium and melt it down into liquid form. During this process, the waste and byproduct is separated from the pure Tiberium liquid, which is then transferred to 2 enclosed holding tanks. From here, I assume that the liquid Tiberium is then molded into ingots underground beneath the refinery, since most base structures have subterranean components to them. Of course, refineries can only process so much Tiberium at one time. Sometimes harvesters are able to extract an excess amount of the crystal, which can't be stored in the refineries themselves. For such situations, this is where Tiberium silos come in. There really isn't too much to say about Tiberium silos, as their function is pretty straightforward. They allow for the long-term storage of collected Tiberium crystals. How the process of placing the crystals in the silos works actually starts at the refinery. When the local storage of the refinery can no longer hold any more raw Tiberium crystals, they are then transported by way of a system of underground pipes, connected to wherever the silos are located. This is so that the harvesters themselves don't have to worry about making 2 separate stops on their way to deposit their collected crystals. They always unload at the refinery, which immediately processes the amount that it can at that time, while the rest gets sent to the silos. The more silos there are at a base, the more Tiberium that can be stored. Though the silo's function has remained consistently the same since the arrival of Tiberium on Earth, the design itself has changed over the years. Examples include the rectangular extrusion from the first generation silo, which was commonly seen throughout the First War. One could even tell when the silo was full thanks to it having a glass dome, with which one could view the large pile of raw Tiberium inside. The silos commonly seen throughout Tib War 2 had 5 lightning-shaped extrusions around the cylindrical structure, and the roofs themselves would also glow green to indicate that the silo has reached full capacity. Just as the evolution of Tiberium changed the way it was processed at the refinery, it also changed how it was stored in the silos as well. Of course, GDI and Nod developed their own unique designs, but instead of storing the raw crystals, they would store the already melted down liquid Tiberium. For the Nod silos, 4 notches would turn green to indicate its level of capacity. All 4 green notches means that the silo is full. And for the GDI one, an indicator which looks similar to a thermostat shows the amount it has stored, a full green indicator representing a full silo. However, there were still some silos that stored raw Tiberium, more specifically large neutral silos. Neutral meaning that they are not initially under the control of GDI or the Brotherhood. I believe that these act similar to the Tiberium spikes, and that they are owned by either private companies or other countries. But of course that won't stop Nod or GDI from making use of them during combat operations. For the longest time, GDI and Nod thought of themselves as the primary benefactors of Tiberium harvesting and processing. But these notions would be shattered during the Third Tiberium War, with the invasion of the extraterrestrials known as the Scrin. These aliens proved themselves to be the true masters of Tiberium harvesting and processing, making the methods utilized by both Nod and GDI primitive by comparison. The Scrin had no need to use machines in order to harvest Tiberium from the Earth. Instead, the harvesters were practically biomechanical lifeforms themselves, able to float several meters off the ground, and using long, thin tentacles at the front of their bodies in order to scan the ground for Tiberium. Harvesters belonging to the Reaper sect even have a personal energy shield to provide them further protection. Once they've found a field, they then proceed to harvest the crystal by breaking them down at a molecular level, allowing them to absorb the particulate matter into their mouth. Once they are sufficiently full of the crystal, the harvesters then drop it off at the refinery, or as the Scrin call it, the extractor. The harvester transfers the Tiberium particulates from its mouth into the front port of the extractor, where it is then processed. As to what exactly the Scrin process the Tiberium into is unclear. Perhaps it's some kind of energy which allows them to warp in new structures and units. But whatever it is, it means that the aliens have no use for storage silos. They could even extend the life of Tiberium fields using structures called growth accelerators, which they could build over fissures in the earth. These structures stimulate the Tiberium veins deep underground, allowing the crystals to grow at a faster rate. Though the Scrin proved themselves superior in the ways of Tiberium, unfortunately that alone was not enough to prevent their defeat by the human forces of Earth. In the aftermath of the Scrin invasion, both GDI and Nod realized they still had more to learn about this dangerous yet valuable crystal. New possibilities awaiting to be discovered involved in its harvesting, processing, and storage. As the late Dr. Mobius famously said,
"The possibilities of Tiberium are limitless."